Je voudrais introduire Richard Sennett. Ça a été pour nous et pour moi un immense plaisir quand Richard Sennett nous a dit qu'il pouvait venir parler. Je vais faire une présentation un peu personnelle. Je signale quand même au passage qu'il y a une dizaine de livres de Richard Sennett qui sont traduits en français, dont le dernier en 2013, et que donc c'est un auteur auquel on a facilement accès. C'est un des très grands, tout grands sociologues actuels qui a marqué considérablement. Il est à London School of Economics et à New York. Il est à la fois un sociologue et un écrivain, et si j'ai bien compris, un musicien. Je dois dire qu'à titre personnel, moi j'ai été formé par des sociologues qui croyaient à l'importance de la littérature et qui eux-mêmes écrivaient des romans, comme Georges Ballandier et Jean Duvigneau. Et j'ai le souvenir que dans les années 80, jeunes sociologues qui se sentaient un peu enfermés dans la macro-sociologie à la française, qu'elle soit marxiste, durkheimienne ou autre, et on lisait avec passion ce qui a été traduit sous le titre « Les tyrannies de l'intimité ». Et on avait l'impression qu'avec Sennett, on avait à la fois quelqu'un qui était dans un autre monde, le monde de la philosophie pragmatique, etc., mais qui en même temps était très dans le monde européen, y compris dans un monde européen qui était un peu interdit aux Français, notamment Max Weber et compagnie, et puis en même temps quelqu'un qui connaissait bien la France, puisqu'il s'intéressait à Michel Foucault, etc., etc. Et donc Sennett a été pour nous vraiment une vraie référence, et je suis tellement heureux de l'accueillir aujourd'hui. Et en même temps, s'il est là, c'est pas simplement pour me faire plaisir, c'est parce que c'est quelqu'un qui a beaucoup écrit sur la ville. Et donc, après l'intervention de Saskia, on a un autre point de vue, d'une certaine manière, même s'il y a des proximités, on a une autre manière de lire la ville à partir d'une lecture anthropologique, sociologique, historique. Et donc, je donne avec grand plaisir la parole à Richard Sennett.
Bon, malheureusement, je dois parler en anglais. Mon français est épouvantable. Mais je parle lentement et j'espère que vous pouvez me suivre. Every 20 years, the United Nations sponsors a conference on the environment called Habitat. And this year was the third of these. They began in 1976. And this one devoted to cities in particular. The scientific committee of the UN Habitat group, of which I was a part, was charged with something that was extremely difficult, because we follow by a year the work in Paris of the C20 group on environment change. And we were asked by the dirigeant of the C20, what do cities have to do with environment change? How do you relate to us? It was a particularly difficult task for us, which I'm going to describe to you today. It was difficult because of a certain way in which the C20 has framed the process of environment change. We all know the environment is going to change. Sea levels will rise, the planet will become hotter. Basically, after 2050, the issue of water, whether too much or too little, is going to be the primary focus of dealing with climate change. We know that's going to happen, but we don't know how it's going to happen, particularly. We can't predict We know that, for instance, hurricanes, like the ones we are seeing now, will become more intense, but we can't know exactly when they'll happen or where they'll happen. More fundamentally, we know that the Gulf Stream is going to shift its course, but we can't predict the means or the process by that's going to happen. In other words, the challenge that they gave to us was, we're certain that something is going to radically alter. The end is clear, but the means are uncertain. They're open. How would you, in thinking about how cities develop, respond to that particular challenge of dealing with uncertainty, a lack of closure, a lack of predictability in the process of growth? This was a real challenge I've worked for the United Nations for too long, although I speak here just personally. This was a real challenge to us because most of the development work that I have seen in the UN and unfortunately been associated with has tried to fix the environment, to determine it, to create structures which are durable and in that sense sustainable over a long period. The notion that we should learn how to build the urban environment in a more flexible and uncertain way is not how the World Bank or the IMF or the UN Development Fund thinks. They want certainty. And that has been a contrary process to the challenge given to us by our environmental colleagues. At the heart of this problem is, it seems to me that, from my experience, that the problem with modern urban development is that it's an over-determined form. There's too tight a connection between form and function. I give you a very specific example of this. We, the World Bank, put a great deal of money into building a road system in Shanghai to get workers to an enormous factory complex on the northeast of Shanghai. It took a long time, it's very expensive. The road is beautiful. It's the most wonderfully laid out road. It's verges, it's heaven, it's planted, and so on. There's only one trouble, that in the 10 years it took to build, the factory complex that it was going to service has moved to Vietnam. The Chinese have grown up, so it's a road to nowhere. In the environmental world, we've had a similar problem, for instance, with flood barriers in Bangladesh. We've built them for an environment which no longer operates in that way. Floods come into Bangladesh in a way that these poured concrete flood barriers can't really adapt to. So the issue for us is how to free us from this tyranny of form function, which is very attractive to most bankers because you can measure it efficiently. Form function is something that is quantifiable, whereas shifts, even profound shifts, like the change in the Gulf Stream, elude simple quantification. So that is the problem that I and the other members of the scientific community, including Saskia Sassen, Juan Clos, who's the director of UN Habitat, Henk Ovink, who is the Minister of Water for the Netherlands, Richard Burdett, who directs the cities program at London School of Economics, and numerous other experts faced. So that's the problem I want to, I'm very long-winded. You have to forgive me. I have to discipline myself. I'm going to talk to you about, since we are in a place of architecture, about how we went about this problem, addressing this problem in terms of built form. Our point of reference was a famous document made by Chiam, the Congress, the Corbusier Congress, in 1933, called the Charter of Athens. The Charter of Athens was actually written on a boat, and it is the clearest statement of the way to build a city so that its forms and its functions interact as tightly as possible. It comes out of work that Corbusier did himself with the Plan Voisin for Paris in the mid-20s, which is to conceive of the city not as mechanical, just a set of mechanical functions, but as something that has to strive for the maximum utility between the way people live and the way the city is built. There are 96 theses in the Charter of Athens. Some of them are very sensible, like there should be a short commute between work and home. Some of them are in the realm of the bizarre, such as that the street is an inefficient medium for urban life, that urban life can flourish vertically, but that horizontally, streets should be given over to transport and to non-social activities. So we took the Charter of Athens, very, very influential document. It shaped, I don't know in France, but it shaped in Britain, in the United States, and in Latin America, the concept of building public housing, for instance, or the development with Lucia Costa of Brasilia itself as a city. Something that works well because everything is integrated and works together. And integration became the, if you like, the buzzword, the justification for this overdetermined relation between form and function. How could we react against this? We thought long and hard about this. The UN is a very complicated place, and the scientific committee decided to issue a little rebuff in its own right, not as official UN policy, to the Charter of Athens about this, called the Quito Papers, because Habitat 3 appeared in Quito last autumn. And you can find these online. You can also find a film that we made about the alternative that we saw to this. And the Quito Papers are about how to open up the city in a way that Corbusier and the followers of modernism had, in our view, closed it down through overdetermined form. And at this point, I speak purely for myself. What does an open city look like? One answer to me came when I taught at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I was a professor there for a long time. And my office was next to something called the Media Lab, which in the late 20th century was an enormously innovative, messy, wasteful a laboratory looking at new kinds of media. And I remember someone saying to me one day, here's the contrast between what we do and the research Microsoft does. And for this for this description, you have to remember that Microsoft was funding the Media Lab. He said Microsoft deals in the realm of closed thinking. That is, it asks yes or no questions, Boolean questions if you like. It tests hypotheses. It finds out what works and discards what doesn't work. It is a mindless way of doing an experiment, but it's a very certain one. It's either yes or no, right or wrong, work or not work. The Media Lab, in all sorts of things like an electronic toaster, a car that was supposed to enhance the aesthetics of driverless motion, don't ask me what that means, all sorts of other things, cheap computers, prosthetic devices for hands, was asking not yes-no questions, but what-if questions. They were doing lots of experiments to find out not what works, but why something doesn't work, what's interesting about a malfunctioning procedure. And they called this it's a what-if kind of procedure, open research. So that the closed becomes the world of the known, and the open becomes the world of the unknown. A better way, I think, to put this is that closed means, in this MIT context, clarity, and open means complexity. Well, I thought about this quite a bit. I'm not very technologically minded, but that seemed to be fine at MIT, which is undoubtedly the world's greatest university. I thought quite a lot about what that contrast between the clear and the complex, the closed and the open, how it might be related to cities. And I could talk to you endlessly about this. I won't. I'm going to single out 3 open forms of building that we could do today to make cities more open, and to increase their ability to be flexible and adaptive, particularly to issues like climate change. And these 3 qualities are porosity, the border boundary distinction, and incomplete form. And let me explain each. Porosity is the quality of an environment being able to take in outside elements and retain within itself elements that are necessary for its own stabilization. In the biological world, porosity is defined by a cell wall, which has this exchange of elements between inside and outside. It's not open in the sense that anything flows through. There's a combination of taking in and of resistance. There's a dialogue in a cell wall between openness in the normal sense and resistance. And it creates, in the cell membrane, and it creates a system of tension which maintains life. A cell wall contrasts in this to a cell membrane contrasts in this to a cell wall, which keeps out the outside. The same thing is true in natural ecologies. Here it's the distinction between borders and boundaries. A border is like a membrane. In natural ecologies, for instance, where the water meets the land, is open in that sense. Organisms feed off of each other. This is the zone where these two things interact of highest evolution, more speeded up. The edge is alive. Whereas in a boundary, like a national frontier, the edge is dead. It keeps things out. The notion is that the edge is not a significant, the edge is low energy, whereas the border is high energy. So this contrast of porosity understood in that sort, which is taking things in, pushing them back, but something which has got a lot of energy into it, we began thinking about in terms of built form. Most notably, the ways in which today most of the high investment building in the world, particularly in the developing world, is oriented to the boundary, to the closed form, to the inert edge. The most popular form of building in the world, as you may know, is the gated community, which absolutely exemplifies this. But we find it also at a more macro level in the disconnect, for instance, in Delhi between developed and undeveloped parts of the city. There is no border between them which is porous, save in places like Nehru Place, which is a market in Delhi. But for the majority of development in Delhi, the developed parts are isolated from the non-developed parts. That is closure. It has profound social as well as architectural consequences, urban consequences. The poor, Dalits, and others don't see those who are literally gated away from those who are in the process of development in the city. And this is an almost universal process in development. So our recommendation to planners is don't concentrate on those edges between poor and rich, or functionally, between living and working, schools and commerce, to make them more porous, to have more contact, rather than to make self-enclosed projects. And that requires planning. The capitalism today, as you can see from what Saskia has presented to you, capitalism invests in self-contained projects, which are then financialized. City planning is something that's actually disappearing in modern development. People are not planning whole cities, but they're planning districts or parts or projects, which can be financed. The second issue that we the third issue that we dealt with was the issue of incomplete form. This is, again, part of, if you think of the highway to nowhere, an alternative, which is a complete form. There's a highway, there are workers, and there's work, and all put together and integrated. Incomplete form doesn't do that. It half-builds. One model for this, for instance, is Enrique Aravena's housing projects in Iquique, in Chile, which are half-built houses which workers themselves then fill in. We're interested in that with schools, how to build schools incompletely so that they're unresolved by the time they're open, so that they're gradually colonized by the people who use them. So these are three of the planning strategies that the Quito Papers advocates: porosity, borders rather than boundaries, and incomplete form. Let me say in conclusion that, as you will have seen from Saskia's talk, a different kind of financial and, I would say, political economy regime is required in order to open up the city. It's one in which global capital seeking to financialize the city is restrained by government. That no, at least for Anglo-Saxons, no, you can't invest here, is something that is the key to doing that. If you buy something, you have to use it, and so on. That the city as a territory no longer becomes a site for essentially monetization. That's a huge prospect. It can be done by policy. It can be done. I'll give you a very simple example of this. Nepal has forbidden Starbucks to operate in Nepal. Why? Because it doesn't take an international corporation to make a cup of coffee. Locals can service the tourists in Nepal. The idea of forbidding some kinds of economic growth, development, of being if you want to put it in those terms, neoliberal, is key to opening up the city. But I would say to you also that there has to be a change in what we think of Anglo-Saxons call morals, and you would call mœurs, which is to say that people have to want to live in complexity rather than live in more simple and, I would say, more primitive conditions. That they want to live with those unlike themselves and to interact with them in a more porous way. This may sound to you like a kind of do-gooder, moralistic in the bad sense way of work. But one thing that we have tried to show in the Quito Papers is that social integration is very easy in workplaces. People, and I'll give you an American example, people who are racists, who don't want blacks to live in their same community, work very well with blacks in the office. And I think that's probably going to be true in France as well, as that you'll find that, I don't know, but I think the same logic appears, that somehow we've pinned the whole issue of openness to where people sleep. And my notion about how to open up the city is to not concentrate so much on housing and concentrate more on the public realm of work, consumption, political activity, sociability, and leisure. And that those should be the sites in which people become accustomed to being with others and want to live in a condition of a porous condition with them, which is complex, rather than an isolated condition which is clear. I would like to close this talk by just saying the consequence of this is, for me, as a sociologist, that people's identity in the city becomes plural, that we stop talking the language of identity of communities, of places, and so on, which is a closed language of who I am. And rather, we should speak another kind of language about being an eremite, which is, what do I do, which always implies other people. Thank you very much.